Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Wealth Stories. Tonight we are following gold, the oldest form of wealth that human civilization has ever known, a metal so ancient in its relationship with human desire that it predates writing, predates kingdoms, and predates every financial institution ever built to manage it. Long before the first coin was struck or the first market opened, someone looked at a gleam of yellow metal in a riverbed and felt something stir in them that they could not entirely explain. That feeling has never gone away. Gold is the one constant in a story of money that is otherwise defined by change. Currencies have come and gone, debased, inflated, abandoned, replaced. Empires have built their wealth on gold and watched it flow away. Governments have promised their paper money was as good as gold, and then quietly stopped making that promise. Banks have been built and destroyed. Financial systems have been redesigned from the foundations up, more than once in the wake of disasters that seem to require entirely new thinking. And through all of it, gold has remained, not always at the center of the monetary system, not always as valuable as its admirers claimed, but always present, always referenced, always the thing that people reach for when they stop trusting everything else. This is a story that begins 7,000 years ago in the burial grounds of a civilization that most people have never heard of, and it ends, if it ends anywhere, in the present moment, where gold is simultaneously a commodity, an investment, a cultural artifact, a reserve asset held by central banks, and the inspiration for a new generation of digital currencies that claim to share its essential properties. In between, it passes through the treasuries of Egyptian pharaohs and the mines of Nubia, through the workshops of Lydian coin makers and the caravans of Mali's richest king, through the galleons of Spain and the tent cities of California, through the deliberations of central bankers and the panic buying of investors who remember 2008. The history of gold as money is not simply a financial history. It is a history of what human beings decide to trust and why, a history of the assumptions that underlie every transaction anyone has ever made. When we understand gold, we understand something about the nature of money itself, that it is not a natural phenomenon but a social agreement, and that the terms of that agreement have changed dramatically over time, sometimes gradually and sometimes in a single dramatic day. Tonight we will move through that history at a gentle pace, from the earliest known gold objects to the ETFs and algorithms of the modern gold market. We will meet the kings and miners and economists and ordinary people whose lives were shaped by this metal. We will ask what gold actually is, not in a chemical sense but in a human one, and we will find that the answer keeps changing. If you enjoy these gentle journeys, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, let your shoulders soften and your breathing slow. Let the day loosen its grip and allow your thoughts to drift back through time as we explore the long and remarkable history of gold as money. Let's begin. Gold was the first metal that human beings recognized as beautiful before they understood it was useful. Most metals reveal their value through use. Iron is hard and holds an edge. Copper is soft enough to work but sturdy enough to hold a shape. Bronze is harder than either and can be cast into weapons or tools that outlast the civilization that made them. But gold is almost entirely useless in a practical sense. It is too soft to make a weapon, too heavy to wear comfortably in large quantities, too rare to build anything significant from. A civilization that had only gold and no other metal would struggle to survive the first winter. And yet human beings have valued gold above almost every other material for as long as recorded history reaches and beyond. The reason most likely is its appearance. Gold does not tarnish, it does not corrode. Buried for thousands of years, it comes out of the ground looking exactly as it did when it went in, bright and warm and catching every available light. In a world where most things rot and rust and fade, gold is the thing that stays. It looks, in short, like permanence, and permanence has always been the quality that frightened and fascinated human beings most. The earliest gold objects we know of were not coins, not jewelry in any decorative sense, and not currency. They were burial goods. The people who made them were placing something with the dead that they believed should accompany a soul into whatever came next, not tools, not food, but something beautiful and incorruptible. The choice of gold for this purpose tells us something important. It was the metal of eternity before it was the metal of wealth. The earliest known gold objects were buried with the dead in Varna, Bulgaria, nearly 7,000 years ago. In the 1970s, archaeologists excavating a cemetery near the Black Sea coast of Bulgaria found something that rewrote the early history of metallurgy. The graves at Varna, dating to roughly 4600 BCE, contained more worked gold than had been found from any site of comparable age anywhere in the world. Thousands of individual gold objects carefully placed with the dead, rings, discs, decorative plaques, and objects whose precise purpose is still debated but whose craftsmanship is unmistakable. The people who made these objects were not a civilization in the monumental sense. They built no pyramids, left no writing, founded no dynasty whose name has survived. They were farmers and traders living along the edges of what would become the modern world. But they had learned to work gold, and they had decided that gold was worth working. They hammered it thin, shaped it into forms that required patience and skill, and buried it in the graves of people they considered important. The social hierarchy implied by the distribution of gold in the Varna cemetery, some graves rich with it, others containing none, suggests that by 4600 BCE, gold was already a marker of status. What the Varna finds tell us is that the human relationship with gold is at least 7,000 years old, older than writing, older than the wheel, older than the great river civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia. By the time anyone sat down to record history in a form that has survived, gold was already ancient in its role as the most valued of materials. The emotional charge it carries is not a modern invention. It is one of the oldest feelings in the human repertoire. Ancient Egypt made gold the metal of gods, and its mines became the engine of an empire. No civilization in the ancient world pursued gold with more determination or more systematic organization than Egypt. The Nile Valley itself contained gold in its eastern desert, in the wadis, the dry riverbeds that cut through the hills between the river and the Red Sea. Egyptian miners worked these deposits from the earliest dynasties, and as the empire expanded southward into Nubia, it gained access to gold deposits that were among the richest in the known world. Egyptian gold had a meaning that was simultaneously religious and political, and it was impossible to separate the two. Gold was the flesh of Ra, the sun god. Its color and its incorruptibility were the physical expression of divine nature. When a pharaoh was buried in a golden mask, the symbolism was theological. The dead king's face was becoming the face of the god. When a temple was decorated with gold leaf, the building was being transfigured into something that belonged not to the mortal world but to the eternal one. Gold in Egypt was not primarily a medium of exchange. It was a medium of transcendence. But it was also a medium of power. The pharaohs who controlled the gold mines controlled something that every king in the ancient world wanted. Egyptian diplomatic correspondence from the 14th century BCE, the Amarna letters, a collection of clay tablets that record exchanges between the Egyptian court and the rulers of Babylon, Assyria, and Canaan, is full of requests for gold from Egyptian kings. One letter from a Babylonian king to the pharaoh Akhenaten reads, "Gold in your country is dirt, one simply gathers it up." The flattery is transparent, but the underlying message is real. Egypt had gold in quantities that the rest of the ancient world found staggering, and that abundance was as important to Egyptian power as its armies. Nubia supplied Egypt with so much gold that the ancient world called it the land of gold. The region south of Egypt's traditional borders, roughly corresponding to the northern part of modern Sudan, was known to the Egyptians as Nubia, a name that may derive from the Egyptian word for gold. Whether or not that etymology is correct, the association was apt. Nubia's gold deposits were extraordinary, and the history of Egyptian imperialism in the region was, to a significant degree, the history of gold extraction. Egyptian control over Nubia was never simply military occupation. It was a complex and often brutal relationship between an empire that needed a resource and a population that possessed it. Nubian gold was mined by forced labor, transported to Egypt under armed escort, and deposited in royal treasuries that grew fat with the accumulated wealth of centuries. The workers who produced this wealth lived and died in conditions that left almost no personal trace in the historical record. What survives are the gold objects, the inventory records, and the monuments that the pharaohs built to celebrate a prosperity that was, in its origins, extracted rather than created. The lesson of Nubian gold, that the people who do the extracting and the people who benefit from the extraction are rarely the same, is one that would repeat itself throughout the entire history of gold mining, from the rivers of California to the mines of South Africa. Gold has always required someone to dig it out of the ground, and those people have rarely been the ones who kept it. The first gold coins were struck in Lydia around 600 BCE, and the world has never looked at gold the same way since. The transformation of gold from a sacred and luxury material into a medium of exchange, from something you owned to something you spent, happened in a small kingdom on the western coast of what is now Turkey. Lydia in the 7th century BCE was a prosperous trading state whose wealth derived from the Pactolus River, which carried alluvial gold and silver mixed together in a natural alloy called electrum. Lydian goldsmiths learned to work electrum, and Lydian rulers learned that a standardized piece of electrum, certified by a royal stamp, could simplify trade enormously. The first Lydian coins were not beautiful objects. They were lumpy, roughly oval pieces of electrum, stamped with the image of a lion's head, the royal symbol, to certify their weight and composition. The concept was simple. Rather than weighing and testing a piece of metal every time a transaction was made, a certified coin provided a shortcut. The king's stamp was a guarantee. The coin was accepted not because the buyer had tested its composition, but because the king's authority stood behind it. The implications of this innovation took centuries to fully unfold. Once gold could be represented by a standardized, certified unit, it could circulate far more freely. It could be counted rather than weighed, recognized rather than tested. The coin turned gold from a material into an instrument, from a thing with intrinsic value into a thing that also carried institutional authority. Every monetary system since has been wrestling in one way or another with the tension between those two properties. Croesus of Lydia became the first king to issue pure gold coins, and his name became a synonym for wealth. King Croesus, who ruled Lydia from roughly 560 to 546 BCE, is remembered primarily for two things: his legendary wealth and the catastrophic overconfidence that led him to attack the Persian Empire and lose everything. The connection between the two is instructive. Croesus possessed, in the gold deposits of Lydia, a resource that made him the richest monarch of his age. He used that wealth to build alliances, fund armies, and consult oracles about the wisdom of war. The oracle at Delphi told him that if he crossed the Halys River to attack Persia, a great empire would fall. He crossed the river. The great empire that fell was his own. Before the fall, Croesus made his most lasting contribution to monetary history. He refined the Lydian electrum coinage into separate pure gold and pure silver coins, the first bimetallic coinage system in the world. The gold coin, called the stater, was minted to a consistent standard of weight and purity that made it reliable far beyond Lydia's borders. Merchants across the eastern Mediterranean began to use Lydian gold coins in their transactions, not because Lydian political authority extended that far, but because the coins were trustworthy. Reliability was the first and most important property of good money, and Croesus had managed to produce it. The expression "rich as Croesus" entered Greek and then Western culture as the standard shorthand for extraordinary wealth. It has survived 25 centuries. The Persian Empire that destroyed his kingdom is long gone. The name of Croesus is still used. The Persian Empire adopted gold coinage and spread it from the Mediterranean to the borders of India. When Cyrus the Great conquered Lydia in 546 BCE and absorbed its treasury into the Persian Empire, he inherited not only Croesus's gold but his monetary system. The Persians developed their own gold coin, the daric, stamped with the image of a running archer, which historians believe represented the king himself, and circulated it across an empire that stretched from Egypt to Central Asia. The daric became one of the first truly international coins, recognized and accepted in markets that had previously used dozens of different local currencies. The Persian monetary system worked because of the empire's extraordinary reach and administrative sophistication. The Achaemenid kings maintained storehouses of gold and silver across their territory, and the ability to tax in coin and pay in coin gave them a flexibility in managing imperial finances that earlier systems had lacked. A Persian satrap, a provincial governor, could receive tax revenues in local currencies, convert them to darics, and transmit them to the imperial center without hauling physical commodities across thousands of miles of desert and mountain. The empire also demonstrated, for the first time on a large scale, something that monetary historians find endlessly interesting: the relationship between political power and monetary authority. The daric was trusted because the Persian Empire was powerful. The Persian Empire was sustained partly because the daric made it easier to finance. Money and political authority reinforced each other in a loop that would define the relationship between governments and currencies for the next 2.5 millennia. Alexander the Great's conquest of Persia released so much gold into circulation that it changed prices across the ancient world. When Alexander the Great's forces swept through the Persian Empire between 334 and 323 BCE, they captured something more valuable than any single battle could have produced: the accumulated treasure of 2 centuries of Persian imperial taxation. The gold and silver stored in the royal treasuries at Persepolis, Susa, and Ecbatana represented wealth gathered from across a vast empire, concentrated in royal storehouses and now suddenly available to be spent. Alexander spent it. He paid his soldiers, funded his campaigns, built cities, and distributed gold with a generosity that would have bankrupted a lesser conqueror. The effect on the economies of the ancient Mediterranean world was dramatic. When a large quantity of gold enters circulation in an economy where the supply of goods and services has not correspondingly increased, prices rise. Scholars who study the ancient economy believe that Alexander's disbursement of Persian treasure contributed to a significant inflation in the Greek world. One of the first recorded instances of what would later be called the quantity theory of money, the idea that prices are determined partly by the amount of money in circulation. The price inflation caused by Alexander's gold lasted for generations, reshaping trade patterns and enriching some while impoverishing others on fixed incomes. It was an early lesson in a truth that monetary historians would rediscover many times. The value of gold is not fixed. It depends on how much of it exists relative to the goods and services available to buy. More gold in circulation means each piece of gold buys less. The metal is precious, but it is not magic. Rome built its empire on silver but counted its wealth in gold, and the difference eventually mattered. The Roman monetary system was built primarily on silver. The denarius, the standard coin of Roman commerce, was silver. Gold was reserved for large transactions, for payments to the army, and for the imperial treasury. But the Romans understood that gold was the ultimate store of value, the metal that retained its worth across the fluctuations of commerce and politics, and they accumulated it accordingly. The Roman gold coin. The aureus was minted to a consistent standard under the early emperors and served as a benchmark for Roman monetary stability. When the aureus held its weight and purity, it could be trusted from Britain to Syria, from the Rhine to the Sahara. The entire Roman world accepted it at face value without testing. That trust was not simply confidence in the metal. It was confidence in the Roman state, in the empire's ability to maintain standards and enforce contracts across an enormous territory. What happened to Roman gold in the 3rd century CE is a case study in the relationship between monetary integrity and political stability. As the empire came under pressure from external invasions and internal political chaos, successive emperors debased the coinage, reducing the silver content of the denarius to fund armies and bribe rivals, then reducing the gold content of the aureus as the crisis deepened. By the 260s CE, Roman coins contained a fraction of their original precious metal content. Merchants responded by demanding more coins for the same goods. Soldiers who were paid in debased currency demanded raises. The debasement that had begun as a short-term solution to a fiscal crisis became a long-term driver of inflation that worsened every other problem the empire faced. The Byzantine Empire maintained gold currency for 1,000 years while the West descended into barter. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476 CE, its monetary system collapsed with it. The coins that had unified trade across the Mediterranean world became scarcer, hoarding became common, and in many parts of the former empire, trade retreated toward barter. The elaborate market economy that had made Roman prosperity possible contracted toward local subsistence. The Eastern Roman Empire, centered at Constantinople, the empire we know as Byzantium, kept the lights on. The Byzantine gold coin, the solidus, was minted to a consistent standard of purity and weight from the 4th century CE through the 11th. A run of monetary stability that no other currency in history has matched. For more than 700 years, the solidus maintained its gold content with such reliability that it circulated as trusted money from England to India, from Scandinavia to Ethiopia. Merchants who had never visited Constantinople and owed no loyalty to the Byzantine emperor still accepted his gold coin because they knew exactly what it was worth. The solidus was not merely a convenient medium of exchange. It was a symbol of the Byzantine Empire's claim to be the legitimate continuation of Rome, the sole remaining great power in a fragmented world, the one institution that had maintained civilization while the West rebuilt itself from rubble. A coin that did not change was a government that did not collapse, and in the turbulent centuries after Rome's fall, that was a form of power that no army could entirely replace. Islamic gold coins called dinars became the reserve currency of medieval trade from Spain to Persia. The Islamic world that expanded rapidly across the Middle East, North Africa, and into Spain during the 7th and 8th centuries inherited a variety of monetary traditions: Byzantine gold, Sassanid Persian silver, and regional coinage systems that varied enormously in their standards and reliability. Out of this diversity, Islamic rulers developed a monetary system centered on gold that would become the dominant currency of medieval international trade. The dinar, from the Latin denarius by way of the Byzantine world, was the Islamic gold coin, minted to a standard established by the Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Malik in 696 CE. The new coin replaced both Byzantine and Sassanid coinage in the territories under Islamic rule, unifying a vast monetary zone under a single reliable standard. The dinar's consistency. It was minted to a standard of roughly 4.25 grams of gold and maintained that standard with unusual reliability across centuries and dynasties, made it the preferred medium for large transactions across the medieval world's most active trade networks. The Islamic trade networks that the dinar facilitated connected the Atlantic coast of Europe to the South China Sea, carrying spices, textiles, metals, and 1,000 other commodities across distances that would have been economically impossible without a reliable monetary medium. Medieval European merchants who traded with the Islamic world needed dinars. Medieval African rulers who exported gold southward to Islamic traders needed dinars. The coin had become, in the fullest sense, an international currency, one that derived its authority not from a single political power but from the trust of a vast commercial community. Mali's Mansa Musa carried so much gold to Mecca that his pilgrimage crashed the gold price across North Africa and the Middle East. In 1324, the emperor of the Mali Empire set out on a pilgrimage to Mecca. His name was Mansa Musa, and he was, by most reasonable estimates, the wealthiest person alive on earth at that moment. The Mali Empire sat atop the gold fields of West Africa, the same fields that had supplied the Islamic trade networks for centuries, and Mansa Musa had spent his reign consolidating control over that production and the trade routes that moved it northward. His pilgrimage caravan was enormous by any standard. Contemporary accounts, written by Islamic scholars who witnessed it in Egypt and elsewhere, describe a procession of 60,000 people, including personal attendants, soldiers, officials, and enslaved people. He reportedly traveled with 80 to 100 camels carrying loads of gold dust. He distributed gold freely in the cities he passed through, as gifts to local rulers, as donations to mosques, as alms to the poor. The effect on the economies of the regions he passed through was devastating. Cairo, where the caravan spent several weeks, experienced a gold price collapse that historians estimate continued for 10 to 12 years after Mansa Musa's visit. When an enormous quantity of gold enters a market suddenly, the value of existing gold falls because there is simply more of it available. Merchants who had priced their goods in gold terms found that the gold they received was worth less than they expected. The Mali emperor's generosity was, in economic terms, an inflationary shock that the regional economies were still absorbing a decade later. The florin of Florence became the first international gold currency of the modern European era. Medieval European kingdoms struggled with a chronic shortage of gold. The deposits that had supplied Roman and Byzantine coinage had been exhausted or were beyond the reach of European powers. Silver was more abundant, and most medieval European coinage was silver, but silver was heavy, relatively low in value per unit of weight, and inconvenient for large transactions. A merchant buying a shipload of cloth needed to move a lot of silver. Florence changed this in 1252 when it introduced the florin, a gold coin struck to a consistent standard of approximately 3.5 grams of pure gold. Florence was at the time one of the most commercially dynamic cities in Europe, a center of the textile trade and the home of banking families whose correspondent networks stretched across the continent. The city had gold because its merchants brought it back from trade with the Islamic world. The decision to mint a gold coin, the first in Western Europe for several centuries, reflected Florence's commercial ambitions and its confidence that a reliable gold currency would lubricate the large transactions that drove its prosperity. The florin spread quickly. Within decades, it was being accepted in markets from England to the eastern Mediterranean. Other cities minted their own gold coins, the ducat of Venice, the écus of France, but the florin was the pioneer, and its influence on subsequent European monetary development is hard to overstate. It demonstrated that gold currency could function reliably in a fragmented political landscape, drawing its authority not from a single empire but from the combined confidence of a commercial community that had decided to trust it. Columbus sailed west looking for a route to Asian spices, but what the Spanish crown really wanted was gold. The great European voyages of exploration in the late 15th and 16th centuries were driven by many motives: curiosity, religious ambition, the desire for fame and adventure, but the economic logic that made them financially viable was the expectation of gold. The Spanish crown that funded Columbus's first voyage did not do so out of abstract enthusiasm for geography. It expected a return. And the return it expected, above all else, was access to the gold and spices of Asia. Columbus found neither the Asian route nor the spices. But he found enough gold in the Caribbean to convince the Spanish monarchs that a larger investment was warranted. Subsequent expeditions found more. The conquest of the Aztec Empire in Mexico in the 1520s and the Inca Empire in Peru in the 1530s delivered treasures that exceeded even the most optimistic projections. Not the legendary cities of gold that some conquistadors imagined, but real, substantial quantities of gold and silver accumulated over centuries by sophisticated civilizations. The gold that Hernán Cortés sent back to Spain from the Aztec capital was described by contemporaries in language that mixed awe with barely concealed greed. Gold objects of extraordinary craftsmanship, masks, jewelry, ceremonial items, vessels, were melted down into bullion and shipped across the Atlantic, losing their form but retaining their weight. The act of melting was not simply practical. It was ideological. The conversion of indigenous art into Spanish money erased the civilization that had produced it and replaced it with a value system that only recognized the metal. The conquest of the Aztec and Inca empires transferred more gold to Europe than had been seen in centuries. The scale of precious metal that flowed from the Americas to Europe in the 16th century was unprecedented in the history of the world. Estimates vary, but historians believe that between 1500 and 1650, something on the order of 180 tons of gold reached Spain from the Americas, along with an even larger quantity of silver from the mines of Peru and Mexico. This was not a gradual accumulation. It was a sudden, massive injection of wealth into a European economy that had been operating with a chronic shortage of precious metal. The human cost of this transfer is almost impossible to calculate. The forced labor systems, the encomienda, the mita, that extracted the metal from the ground killed millions of indigenous people through overwork, disease, and the systematic destruction of their societies. The mines of Potosi in what is now Bolivia are estimated to have consumed the lives of 8 million workers over the colonial period. The gold and silver that made European kings rich and funded the expansion of European empires was produced by a labor force that had no choice and received nothing. Spain, which received the largest share of American precious metal, did not become lastingly wealthy from it. The gold and silver flowed through the Spanish economy, enriched merchants and bankers in Antwerp and Genoa who handled the trade, and dissipated across Europe without fundamentally transforming Spain's productive capacity. The economists debate about why this happened, why the recipient of the greatest treasure transfer in history remained, by the end of the 17th century, a relatively underdeveloped economy is still active. One part of the answer is simply that money is not wealth. The things that gold can buy are wealth. Spain spent its American treasure on wars rather than investment, and the wars consumed what the mines produced. Spanish gold from the Americas caused one of the first recorded inflations in modern European history. The arrival of American precious metal in quantities that dwarfed anything previously available in Europe produced a phenomenon that contemporaries noticed but struggled to explain. Prices rose across Europe through the 16th century, not briefly, not in one place, but persistently across a generation, in ways that affected everything from grain to cloth to the cost of labor. The French economist Jean Bodin, writing in the 1560s, offered what is now recognized as one of the earliest formulations of the quantity theory of money. Prices, he argued, had risen primarily because there was more money, more gold and silver circulating in the economy. More money chasing the same goods meant each unit of money was worth less. The insight was correct, though the full explanation for the price revolution of the 16th century involves other factors as well, including population growth and changes in agricultural productivity. What the price revolution demonstrated, for the first time on a scale large enough to be unmistakable, was that gold itself could lose value. It was not an inert store of wealth that maintained its purchasing power automatically. Its value is relative to the quantity of other goods available, relative to the total supply of gold in the economy. The discovery of American gold had made existing gold worth less in terms of what it could buy. This was a profoundly disorienting insight for a civilization that had treated gold as the one stable reference point in a chaotic world. Isaac Newton, as master of the Royal Mint, set the gold price that governed English finance for more than a century. Isaac Newton spent the last 30 years of his life not working on physics or mathematics but administering the Royal Mint, the institution responsible for producing England's coinage. He had been appointed warden of the mint in 1696 and became master in 1700, a position he held until his death in 1727. His scientific reputation was by then largely established. His years at the mint were the career of a bureaucrat rather than a genius, though he brought characteristic thoroughness to the work. In 1717, Newton recommended a specific exchange rate between gold and silver that established the official price of gold in terms of the English pound sterling. He set the price at 3/17 10.5 d pounds per troy ounce of gold, a rate that would govern the relationship between gold and the pound for more than 2 centuries. Newton's intention had been to establish a fair valuation between gold and silver, but the rate he chose slightly overvalued gold relative to silver, with the result that silver coin gradually disappeared from circulation as merchants found it more profitable to export it. England effectively moved onto a gold standard through this process, not because anyone decided that gold should be the sole monetary metal, but because Newton's arithmetic made silver unprofitable to hold as coin. The lesson is one that monetary historians returned repeatedly. The formal intentions of monetary policy often matter less than its mathematical consequences, and the people who set policy do not always understand which of those consequences will prove most important. The California gold rush of 1848 brought more gold to the surface in a decade than had been mined in the preceding century. On January 24, 1848, a carpenter named James Marshall found flakes of gold in the American River at a sawmill he was building for John Sutter in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. He tried to keep the discovery quiet and failed. Within months, the news had spread across the United States and then around the world. By 1849, tens of thousands of people from every continent were converging on California with picks, shovels, and the conviction that their fortune was waiting for them in the hills. The scale of the California gold rush was extraordinary. In 1848, perhaps 14,000 people lived in California, most of them indigenous. By 1855, the population had grown to 300,000, composed of people from across the United States, from Mexico and South America, from China and Australia and Europe. They came because the gold was real. The California fields produced between $10 million and $40 million worth of gold per year in the early 1850s, at a time when the entire United States money supply was measured in the hundreds of millions. The rush was, briefly, the largest gold-producing event in human history. The gold rushed east, through San Francisco and across the continent, flowing into a monetary system that had been operating with a relative scarcity of precious metal. Prices rose in California, where miners spent their earnings on food and supplies in a market where few people were producing either. Prices rose more slowly across the rest of the United States as the new gold entered circulation. The world's monetary systems, linked through gold, all felt the adjustment, a reminder that gold, even when it seems like a natural and neutral foundation for money, produces effects that ripple outward whenever its supply changes significantly. The Australian gold rush followed the California rush and made Melbourne one of the wealthiest cities in the world. In 1851, 3 years after James Marshall's discovery in California, gold was found near Bathurst in New South Wales and then at Ballarat and Bendigo in Victoria. The Australian gold rush that followed dwarfed even the California rush in some respects. The Victorian fields were richer, more accessible, and attracted migrants from a slightly different set of origins. Large numbers of Chinese immigrants alongside the British, Irish, and European settlers who dominated the California fields. Melbourne, as the port city closest to the Victorian goldfields, was transformed almost overnight from a modest colonial town into one of the most cosmopolitan and prosperous cities in the British Empire. The wealth that flowed through it financed the grand public buildings, the State Library, the Royal Exhibition Building, the public gardens, that still define the city's Victorian-era character. It funded the universities and newspapers and cultural institutions that made Melbourne feel, by the 1880s, like a city that expected to be one of the great metropolises of the modern world. The Australian gold rush also produced one of the most politically significant labor disputes in Australian history. At the Eureka Stockade in December 1854, miners who resented the colonial government's mining license fees and arbitrary enforcement built a stockade, hoisted a flag of their own design, the Southern Cross on a blue field that remains a powerful symbol in Australian culture, and prepared to resist. The government crushed the rebellion in minutes. But the political consequences lasted. Within a year, the license fee had been replaced by a miner's right, and within decades, the democratic reforms that the Eureka miners had demanded were largely in place. Gold brought people to Australia. The politics of gold helped make it democratic. The International Gold Standard gave the Victorian era a financial stability that felt almost magical to those who lived through it. By the 1870s, most of the major trading nations of the world had adopted the gold standard, a monetary system in which each national currency was defined as a fixed quantity of gold, freely convertible on demand. The British pound was worth a specific weight of gold. The German mark was worth a specific weight of gold. the American dollar was worth a specific weight of gold. Because each currency was defined in gold, the exchange rate between any two currencies was essentially fixed. It could fluctuate only within narrow limits determined by the cost of actually shipping gold between countries. For the merchants, investors, and bankers of the late 19th century, the gold standard felt like the natural order of things, a permanent scientific foundation for international commerce that removed the uncertainty of currency fluctuation from long-term planning. A British investor who lent money to an Argentine railroad company did not need to worry about the peso losing value, because the peso was pegged to gold just as the pound was. A German exporter selling machinery to France knew exactly what he would receive in marks for his invoices in francs. The gold standard made the world smaller and more predictable, and the people who benefited from international commerce celebrated it accordingly. What the gold standard could not do was respond to the needs of domestic economies that were growing faster than the gold supply. The amount of gold in the world was fixed by geology and mining technology, not by the needs of trade. When economic activity expanded, when more goods were being produced and more transactions were being made, a gold-based money supply could not easily expand to keep pace. The result in many countries during the late 19th century was deflation. Prices fell because there was not enough money to support the volume of transactions at existing prices. Deflation is comfortable for creditors, who receive back more than they lent in real terms, and uncomfortable for debtors, who must repay more than they borrowed. In a century when farmers across North America and Australia were carrying heavy mortgage debt, this was not an abstract distinction. Britain led the world onto the gold standard, and the rest of the developed world followed because British finance dominated global trade. The gold standard was not adopted by international agreement or the decision of any global authority. It spread because Britain was on it, and British finance, the City of London's banks, insurance companies, and commodity markets, was the center of the world economy. A country that wanted to borrow in London or to attract British investment, or simply to trade on favorable terms with British merchants, found it easier to do so if its currency was on the gold standard. The standard spread through the logic of network effects. It became more valuable to join as more countries joined. Britain had been on a de facto gold standard since Newton's day, had formalized it after the Napoleonic Wars in 1821, and had maintained it through the extraordinary upheavals of the 19th century, the railway mania, the banking crises, the Crimean War, with a consistency that seemed to validate the system's soundness. Germany adopted the gold standard after the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71, using the French indemnity to build its gold reserves. The United States joined formally in 1900, though it had effectively been on gold for most of the preceding decades. By 1913, the gold standard linked nearly every significant national currency in the world. What looked from the outside like a natural and inevitable development was, in reality, a political choice made repeatedly in dozens of countries by governments that could have chosen differently. The gold standard served the interests of creditors, of internationally mobile capital, and of the financial centers that mediated global trade. It served these interests well enough that its costs, the deflation, the inability to respond to domestic economic shocks, the periodic crises when gold flows became destabilizing, were paid without overturning the system for more than 40 years. The First World War shattered the gold standard, and the attempt to restore it made the Great Depression worse. When the First World War began in August 1914, every major belligerent government immediately suspended the gold convertibility of its currency. The war would cost far more than the available gold reserves could finance, and no government was willing to accept the fiscal constraints that the gold standard would have imposed. They printed money, borrowed from their central banks, and issued bonds. By the end of the war, the monetary systems of Europe had been fundamentally transformed, with currencies no longer convertible to gold and inflation that had eroded the real value of savings across the continent. The attempt to restore the pre-war gold standard in the 1920s was driven by a combination of genuine economic conviction. Many economists and policymakers genuinely believed that the gold standard was the natural and correct foundation for sound money and political symbolism. Returning to gold meant returning to normality, to the stable world that had existed before the war, to the financial order that had seemed to guarantee Victorian prosperity. Britain returned to gold in 1925 at the pre-war parity, a decision that John Maynard Keynes immediately criticized as placing the pound at a value too high for British exports to compete. When the Great Depression hit after 1929, the gold standard became a transmission mechanism for catastrophe. Countries that remained on gold were forced to raise interest rates to defend their currency's gold value even as their economies contracted, making the depression worse. The gold standard linked national monetary systems in a way that spread deflationary pressure from the United States outward to every country that maintained convertibility. The countries that abandoned gold earliest, Britain in 1931, the United States in 1933, recovered fastest. The historical record is now unambiguous. The gold standard made the Great Depression worse. John Maynard Keynes called the gold standard a barbarous relic, and the post-war world largely agreed with him. Keynes had been fighting against the gold standard's constraints since the early 1920s, and the Depression seemed to vindicate his arguments with a completeness that even his admirers had not expected. At the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, where the post-war international monetary system was designed, Keynes represented Britain and proposed a genuinely new architecture, an international currency called the banker, managed by an international institution, that would allow countries to expand their money supplies in response to economic needs without being constrained by their gold reserves. The Americans, who emerged from the war as the dominant economic power and the primary holder of the world's gold reserves, rejected Keynes's banker. They preferred a system that placed the dollar, backed by the United States gold reserves, at the center of the international monetary order. The Bretton Woods Agreement established a dollar standard dressed in the language of gold. The dollar would be convertible to gold at $35 per ounce, and other currencies would be pegged to the dollar. It was gold by proxy, and it worked as long as confidence in the dollar's gold convertibility held. The dollar's credibility as a gold-backed currency rested on the United States' willingness to exchange dollars for gold at the official rate whenever foreign central banks requested it. Through the 1950s and early 1960s, this commitment seemed manageable. But as the United States ran persistent balance of payments deficits, spending abroad more than it earned, the supply of dollars in foreign hands grew faster than American gold reserves. Foreign central banks began to exercise their right to convert dollars to gold, and the gold at Fort Knox began to decline. Nixon's closing of the gold window ended gold's formal role in international finance and changed the world. By the early 1970s, the contradiction at the heart of Bretton Woods had become untenable. The United States had more dollars outstanding internationally than it had gold to redeem them, and the gap was growing. France under Charles de Gaulle had made a point of regularly presenting dollars to the Federal Reserve for gold conversion, partly for financial reasons, partly as a statement of French independence from American monetary hegemony. Other countries were following. On the evening of August 15, 1971, President Nixon appeared on television and announced that the United States was suspending the convertibility of dollars into gold immediately, and without prior notice to its allies or trading partners. The decision was made over a weekend at Camp David, with a small group of advisors, with no consultation with the International Monetary Fund or the countries whose currencies were pegged to the dollar. It was, by the standards of international monetary diplomacy, a shock of almost unprecedented abruptness. What followed was a period of monetary experiment as the world adjusted to a system in which no currency was any longer backed by anything except the economic performance and political credibility of the government that issued it. Exchange rates floated. The price of gold, freed from its official ceiling, began to rise. And the question of what gold actually was, if it was no longer money, became genuinely open for the first time in millennia. The gold price rose from $35 to $850 per ounce in the decade after the gold window closed. The price of gold on August 15, 1971 was approximately $42 per ounce, reflecting the official dollar-gold exchange rate that had been slightly adjusted from Nixon's $35 floor. Within months of the window's closure, gold was trading in free markets at prices that reflected something other than official policy. By 1974, when Americans were legally allowed to own gold again, a prohibition dating from Roosevelt's 1933 executive order had remained in place. The price had risen to approximately $185 per ounce. The inflation of the 1970s drove gold higher still. When governments are printing money and inflation is eroding the purchasing power of paper currencies, gold tends to benefit from its historical reputation as a store of value that governments cannot inflate away. The oil shocks of 1973 and 1979, the Iranian Revolution, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the stagflation that afflicted most Western economies, each piece of bad news seemed to send investors toward gold as a refuge from a world that felt less predictable than it had. By January 1980, gold reached $850 per ounce, an increase of more than 20-fold from the official Bretton Woods price 9 years earlier. The peak was brief. When Paul Volcker's Federal Reserve raised interest rates dramatically in 1980 to crush inflation, the logic of holding gold weakened. gold pays no interest. A certificate of deposit at the rates available in 1980 paid very substantial interest. Money flowed away from gold and toward interest-bearing assets. The price fell and kept falling through most of the 1980s and 1990s, reaching a low near $250 per ounce in 1999, a level at which gold mining itself was barely profitable. The gold market of the 20th century was a story of extremes, of price levels that seemed to reflect not so much the metal's intrinsic worth as the current state of collective anxiety about the future. Central banks spent the 1990s selling their gold reserves, convinced that the metal was a relic with no monetary future. The 1990s were, in retrospect, a moment of unusual confidence in the ability of modern financial systems to manage economic stability without the discipline of a precious metal anchor. Inflation had been largely tamed across the developed world. The Cold War had ended. The Great Moderation, the term economists used for the extended period of low inflation and stable growth that characterized the decade, seemed to suggest that central banks had learned enough about monetary management to make the gold standard's constraints unnecessary. In this context, several central banks made the decision to reduce their gold holdings. The Bank of England, under Chancellor Gordon Brown, sold approximately half of Britain's gold reserves between 1999 and 2002 at prices that ranged from roughly $250 to $300 per ounce. The sales were announced in advance, in accordance with transparency requirements which had the effect of depressing the price further before each auction, a decision that later attracted significant criticism when gold prices recovered dramatically. The episode became known informally as Brown's Bottom, a reference both to Gordon Brown and to the price low that the sales helped establish. Other central banks sold more quietly, but the trend was clear. Gold's share of official international reserves fell through the 1990s as countries shifted toward interest-bearing dollar and euro assets. The metal that had underpinned the international monetary system for centuries seemed, at the end of the 20th century, to be on its way to becoming simply another commodity, mined, sold, used in jewelry and electronics, and no longer at the center of how the world thought about money. The 2008 financial crisis reversed that judgment with dramatic speed. The collapse of Lehman Brothers in September 2008, and the near collapse of the global financial system it triggered, did something that no amount of academic argument had managed to do. It made ordinary people and institutional investors genuinely uncertain about the stability of the financial system itself. When the system that holds your savings and processes your payments seems to be failing, the question of what you can trust becomes urgent in a way that it rarely is in normal times. Gold prices, which had already been rising since 2001, accelerated through 2009 and 2010. Demand for gold coins and small bars from retail investors in the United States, Europe, and Asia increased dramatically. ETFs, exchange-traded funds that held physical gold on behalf of investors, grew rapidly, making it possible for anyone with a brokerage account to own a fraction of a gold bar. The SPDR Gold Shares ETF, launched in 2004, became one of the largest ETFs in the world as investors poured money into it. By September 2011, gold had reached approximately $1,920 per ounce, more than double its price at the beginning of the crisis. What the 2008 crisis reminded investors was a truth that the 1990s had temporarily obscured. Gold's value is partly a function of confidence in the alternatives. When paper money seems reliable and financial institutions seem sound, gold is just a metal that pays no interest. When doubt enters the picture, when banks fail and governments print money at extraordinary rates to prevent deeper failures, gold reasserts its ancient role as the thing people trust when they stop trusting everything else. Gold mining is one of the most environmentally destructive industries in human history. The story of gold's extraction is not a gentle one, and it deserves to be told alongside the story of gold's monetary role. The methods that have been used to pull gold from the earth have changed over the centuries, but their environmental consequences have remained consistently severe. Modern industrial gold mining requires the removal and processing of enormous quantities of rock, typically between 5 and 10 tons of ore for every ounce of gold produced in a large open-pit mine, and sometimes much more. The excavations leave pits that can be miles wide and thousands of feet deep, altering landscapes permanently. The chemicals used to extract gold from ore, cyanide, most commonly in modern operations, mercury in historical and artisanal mining, are toxic to water systems and to the organisms that depend on them. Tailings ponds, the repositories for the waste slurry left after gold extraction, have failed at mines around the world, releasing toxic material into rivers and groundwater. Indigenous communities in the vicinity of gold mines have repeatedly found themselves navigating the tension between the economic development that mining can bring and the environmental damage that mining consistently causes. The artisanal gold mining that employs millions of people in Africa, South America, and Asia, often outside formal regulatory frameworks, is particularly associated with mercury contamination, as small-scale miners use mercury amalgamation to separate gold from sediment. The mercury enters waterways, accumulates in fish, and ultimately in the people who eat them. The gold in a piece of jewelry bought in a shopping mall in a wealthy country may have originated in a river system whose ecology was permanently damaged by the process of retrieving it. China and India together consume more gold than the rest of the world combined. The demand for gold in the 21st century is not distributed evenly around the world. China and India, which together account for roughly a third of the world's population, together consume more than half of global gold production, primarily in the form of jewelry, coins, and small bars. The reasons are cultural as much as financial, and understanding them requires understanding the role that gold plays in societies where formal financial institutions have historically been less accessible and less trusted than they are in wealthy Western countries. In India, gold jewelry has served for generations as a form of savings that is portable, private, and independent of any bank or government. A family that accumulates gold over years through purchases at festivals, weddings, and other occasions is building a reserve that can be liquidated in times of need without involving a financial institution, without creating a record that tax authorities might notice, and without depending on a banking system that has historically been both less accessible in rural areas and less trustworthy than gold in periods of political instability. The gold jewelry of India, estimated to represent the world's largest private holding of gold, in the hundreds of thousands of tons accumulated in households and temples across the country, is not merely decorative. It is a decentralized national treasury, built piece by piece over generations by families who understood, in a way that financial economists sometimes forget, that trust in institutions is not a constant but a variable, and that something which has been valued for 7,000 years is a more reliable store of value than any promise a government has ever made. Fort Knox holds approximately 4,500 tons of gold, and no one has audited it comprehensively since 1953. The United States Bullion Depository at Fort Knox, Kentucky, is arguably the most famous gold storage facility in the world, even among people who know very little about gold or monetary history. Built in 1936 to store the gold that Franklin Roosevelt's administration had required American citizens to surrender during the Depression, it has become a cultural shorthand for the idea of vast, impregnable, inaccessible wealth. The phrase, "it's like trying to break into Fort Knox," has entered the language. The facility holds approximately 4,580 metric tons of gold, about 3% of all the gold ever mined in human history, stored in stainless steel coin melting bars in a basement vault under multiple layers of security. The gold is not and has not been for decades backing any currency. It is simply there, a relic of the monetary system that Nixon ended, maintained by inertia and by the political difficulty of deciding what else to do with it. The last comprehensive audit of the gold at Fort Knox was conducted in 1953 under the Eisenhower administration. Subsequent inspections have been partial. Periodic calls for a full independent audit, most recently from politicians who are either skeptical about the gold's existence or curious about its condition, have not resulted in one. The question of whether the gold is there in the quantities claimed in the purity specified remains, technically, unverified by any independent authority. Most people assume it is. Most people have no particular reason to verify that assumption. Cryptocurrency advocates argued that Bitcoin was digital gold, and the comparison reveals what gold actually is. In 2008, the same year the financial system nearly collapsed, an anonymous person or group published a paper describing Bitcoin, a digital currency that shared several properties with gold. Like gold, Bitcoin would be scarce. The total supply was capped at 21 million coins built into the software's design. Like gold, Bitcoin could not be inflated away by a government decision to print more. Like gold, Bitcoin was intended to exist outside the control of any particular political authority. The digital gold narrative that Bitcoin advocates developed over the following decade drew explicitly on the history of gold's monetary role. Gold had served as money, the argument went, primarily because it was scarce, durable, portable, divisible, and hard to counterfeit. Bitcoin had all of these properties in digital form, without the inconveniences of physical weight and the environmental costs of mining. If what made gold valuable as money was its properties rather than its physical nature, then those properties could be replicated digitally, and the resulting digital asset would inherit gold's monetary value. What the comparison reveals, whatever one thinks of Bitcoin's prospects, is something important about what gold actually is. Gold's value has never been purely a function of its physical properties. It has always been partly a function of convention, of the shared belief that gold is valuable, a belief so deeply embedded in human history that it can survive the collapse of every monetary system that was built on it. Gold in 2024 is not backing any currency. It is not legally required tender anywhere. The Bretton Woods system that made it the foundation of international finance ended more than 50 years ago. And yet the price of gold in 2024 is approximately $2,000 per ounce, higher in real terms than almost any point in history except brief crisis peaks. The convention survives, and because the convention survives, the value survives. The price of gold in any given year tells you less about gold than it tells you about the fears of the people buying it. Gold has no earnings, it produces no revenue, it pays no dividends, it is incapable of becoming more useful than it already is. An ounce of gold in 2024 will do exactly the same things that an ounce of gold did in 1924. It will resist tarnish, conduct electricity moderately well, and look beautiful when worked by a skilled artisan. The physical substance has not changed. What changes is the demand for it, and the demand for gold is primarily driven by a specific kind of fear. The fear that paper money will lose its value, that financial institutions will fail, that governments will become unable or unwilling to honor their obligations. When these fears are high, gold prices rise. When confidence in paper money and financial institutions is high, gold prices tend to fall or stagnate. Gold, viewed this way, is a fear index, a continuous, real-time measurement of how much the people with money to invest trust the systems that are supposed to manage their money. This interpretation explains patterns that would otherwise seem puzzling. Gold rose dramatically after 2008 not because anything had changed about gold, but because the financial crisis had changed something about the confidence people had in the financial system. It fell in the 1990s not because gold had become less useful, but because the confidence of that decade made the insurance that gold provides feel unnecessary. Buying gold is, at some level, a vote of no confidence in governments, in central banks, in the institutions that modern economies depend on. The fact that these votes never stop coming, that gold always finds buyers at some price, tells us something about the durability of human distrust. Every civilization that has ever encountered gold has concluded, independently, that it is worth more than almost anything else. This is perhaps the most remarkable fact in the entire history of gold. The ancient Egyptians, the Lydians, the Aztecs, the Chinese, the peoples of West Africa, the civilizations of South Asia, none of these cultures were in contact with each other when they first began to value gold. They arrived at their high estimation of the metal independently, through separate processes of observation and convention, and they all reached the same conclusion. The most common explanation emphasizes gold's physical properties, its color, its luster, its incorruptibility. These properties made gold stand out from every other material available to pre-industrial civilizations. Most things fade, tarnish, rot, rust, or break. Gold does not. In a world where permanence was rare and change was usually for the worse, something that kept its brilliance for thousands of years was worth preserving, worth accumulating, worth fighting for. But physical properties alone cannot explain the magnitude of gold's value across such diverse cultures and such long stretches of time. Part of the explanation must lie in the social function of value itself. Value is not inherent in objects, it is agreed upon by communities. Once a community agrees that gold is valuable, that agreement creates a self-reinforcing expectation. Gold is valuable because everyone expects everyone else to treat it as valuable. The expectation is self-fulfilling, and once established across multiple generations and multiple cultures, it becomes the closest thing to an objective fact that a social convention can achieve. The story of gold is the story of what human beings trust when they stop trusting everything else. Every financial system ever built has been an attempt to solve the same problem. How do you make it possible for people who do not know each other to exchange value reliably at a distance across time? Gold was the first widely accepted answer to that question, and it held the answer for most of human history because it required no trust in any institution, only trust in the metal itself, which was consistent enough in its properties to be assessed by anyone with eyes and the skill to test it. Paper money was a more efficient answer, lighter, more convenient, easier to produce in the quantities a growing economy needed. But paper money required trust in the institutions that issued it, and those institutions, governments, central banks, commercial banks, had a long and mixed record of deserving that trust. When the record was good, paper money worked beautifully. When it was bad, when governments debased their currency, when banks failed, when financial systems revealed themselves to be built on foundations shakier than their facades suggested, people reached for gold. They still do. The South African gold rush created the world's deepest mines and one of its most unequal societies. In 1886, a gold-bearing reef was discovered on the Witwatersrand, the ridge of white waters south of what is now Johannesburg. The discovery was unremarkable in itself. A prospector named George Harrison found traces of gold on a farm, reported them, and was paid £10 for his claim. What Harrison had found, without fully understanding it, was one of the largest gold deposits in the history of the world, a reef of gold-bearing conglomerate that stretched for more than 60 miles underground and reached to depths that dwarfed any mine previously attempted. Within a decade, the Witwatersrand had become the most productive gold field on Earth. The Randlords, the mining magnates who rushed in to capitalize on the discovery, men with names like Cecil Rhodes, Barney Barnato, and Alfred Bate, built fortunes that rivaled those of the American industrial barons of the same era. Johannesburg grew from nothing to a city of 100,000 people in the space of 10 years. The gold production from the Rand, as it came to be known, added more to the world's monetary gold supply in the first decade of the 20th century than had been produced anywhere in the preceding 50 years. The human cost of this gold was borne almost entirely by the black African labor force that worked the mines. The system that emerged, cheap, controlled migrant labor drawn from across southern Africa through a combination of economic desperation and legal coercion, was the foundation on which South Africa's apartheid system would later be built. The mines that produced the gold that underpinned the international gold standard were operated by a labor force that was legally prohibited from owning property in most of the country, and that lived in conditions designed to maximize production at minimum cost. The history of the gold standard cannot be fully told without acknowledging the human system that made its gold supply possible. The Klondike Gold Rush sent 100,000 people into the Yukon wilderness for a few years of extraordinary drama. In August 1896, gold was discovered along Bonanza Creek, a tributary of the Klondike River in what is now the Yukon Territory of Canada. The news reached the outside world the following summer, when ships carrying gold and prospectors arrived in Seattle and San Francisco, and the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Within a year, an estimated 100,000 people had set out for the Klondike, most of them ill-equipped for what they would find. The route to the goldfields required crossing the coast mountains at either the Chilkoot Pass or the White Pass, steep, dangerous mountain crossings that claimed lives and exhausted even experienced outdoorsmen. The Canadian government, determined to maintain order, required each prospector to bring a year's worth of supplies, approximately a ton of goods, before crossing the border. Lugging that weight up a mountainside in the Alaskan winter is not a metaphor for anything. It is simply an extraordinarily difficult physical task, accomplished by tens of thousands of people who had decided that the possibility of gold was worth almost any cost. By the time most of them arrived, the best claims had already been staked. The Klondike produced real gold, approximately 12.5 million troy ounces over the course of the rush, but the wealth was concentrated among the early arrivals and the supply merchants who sold food, tools, and transportation to the prospectors at prices that reflected the absence of any competition. Dawson City, the boomtown at the heart of the Klondike, briefly held 30,000 people, with opera houses and hotels and newspapers, and was largely abandoned within a decade as the surface gold ran out and the hard rock mining that replaced it required industrial capital rather than individual initiative. The Klondike is a story of collective human energy, remarkable in its scale, expended in the pursuit of a metal whose location was determined by geological accident and whose value was determined by social convention. Gold confiscation in 1933 forced ordinary Americans to surrender their gold to the government. On April 5, 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102, which required most Americans to surrender their gold coins, gold bullion, and gold certificates to the Federal Reserve in exchange for paper dollars at the official rate of $20.67 per troy ounce. The order exempted jewelry, industrial uses, and small amounts for personal use, but effectively made it illegal for ordinary Americans to hold gold as an investment or a monetary reserve. The reasoning behind the order was monetary. The gold standard required the Federal Reserve to maintain gold backing for its currency, and the wave of bank failures and gold hoarding that had marked the early depression had depleted reserves and constrained the Fed's ability to expand the money supply. By calling in the gold, the government hoped to increase its reserves, devalue the dollar, and provide monetary stimulus to an economy in desperate need of it. After the gold had been collected, the official price was raised to $35 per ounce, a devaluation of approximately 40% that transferred wealth from gold holders to the government, at least on paper. The confiscation was controversial then and remains a touchstone in American libertarian thought today, cited as evidence that governments cannot be trusted with gold, or more broadly with monetary authority of any kind. What is less often noted is that the policy worked in a narrow sense. The monetary expansion it enabled did help stabilize the economy and contributed to the recovery that began in 1933. The question of whether the ends justified the means is one that depends largely on what one thinks governments owe their citizens in a crisis, and on which citizens one is primarily concerned about. The gold market in London has set the benchmark price for gold twice a day since 1919. The London Gold Fix, the twice-daily process by which the gold price is set for international markets, has its origins in September 1919 when 5 banks gathered in the offices of N.M. Rothschild and Sons in the City of London and agreed on a price for gold. The mechanism was simple and slightly theatrical. A representative of each bank would raise a small Union Jack flag to indicate that their client orders at the current price were not yet fully satisfied, and lower it when they were. The chairman would propose prices, the flags would go up and down, and when all flags were down simultaneously, the fix was declared. For most of the 20th century, the fix was conducted by a small group of banks in a room, using actual flags at 10:30 in the morning and 3:00 in the afternoon London time. It set the benchmark price that was referenced in contracts, used for valuing gold reserves and quoted in newspapers around the world. The process was private, the deliberations were not public, and the potential for the participating banks to use the information they gathered during the process for their own trading purposes was, for decades, simply accepted as part of how markets worked. The financial scandals of the post-2008 period, which included the revelation that similarly structured benchmark-setting processes in the interest rate and foreign exchange markets had been manipulated by participating banks, led to changes in the gold fix as well. The physical flags were eventually replaced by electronic platforms, and the process was renamed the LBMA gold price and placed under oversight that was intended to make it more transparent and manipulation-resistant. The underlying function remains the same, setting, twice a day, the reference price for the most ancient monetary metal in the world. Gold exchange-traded funds made it possible for anyone to own gold without ever touching it. The exchange-traded fund that holds physical gold, buying gold bars, storing them in secure vaults, and issuing shares that represent fractional ownership of those bars, was one of the genuinely useful financial innovations of the early 21st century. Before ETFs, the options for an ordinary investor who wanted gold exposure were limited and inconvenient. Buy physical coins or small bars and store them yourself, which required security arrangements. Buy gold mining stocks, which introduced company-specific risks beyond the gold price, or use futures contracts, which required rolling positions and had their own complications. The SPDR Gold Shares ETF, launched in the United States in November 2004, made gold as easy to buy as a share of stock. An investor with a standard brokerage account could buy gold in the morning and sell it in the afternoon, receiving a price that tracked the physical gold market closely and paying expenses of less than 0.5% per year. The gold backing the ETF was held in HSBC's vault in London, audited regularly, and was in theory available for redemption, though in practice almost no retail investor ever redeemed their shares for physical gold. The gold ETFs grew rapidly, particularly after the financial crisis of 2008. At their peak in 2020, The major gold ETFs held more than 3,000 tons of gold, more than the official gold reserves of most countries. They had made gold accessible to a population of retail investors who were interested in the asset's crisis-hedging properties but had no desire to keep gold bars in their homes. The democratization of gold ownership that the ETFs represented was, in its way, a continuation of the process that Lydian coins had begun 26 centuries earlier, making gold more accessible to more people by reducing the friction of holding it. Central banks began buying gold again after 2008, revering a decade of selling. The central banks that had spent the 1990s reducing their gold reserves reversed course after 2008. China began systematically increasing its gold holdings, though the pace and scale of the accumulation were not always fully disclosed in real time. Russia, under a policy explicitly aimed at reducing dependence on dollar-denominated assets, accumulated gold steadily through the 2010s, reaching more than 2,000 tons by 2020. India, Turkey, Poland, Hungary, and several other countries added to their reserves. The motivations were various. For Russia and China, accumulating gold was partly a strategic decision, a hedge against the possibility that the United States might use the dollar's dominant role in international finance as a weapon through sanctions or asset freezes. For smaller countries, increasing gold reserves was partly a response to the low interest rates that made holding dollars or euros less attractive, and partly a precautionary accumulation during a period when the global financial system felt less stable than it had in the 1990s. The return of central banks to the gold market as net buyers after a decade as net sellers was one of the more significant structural changes in the gold market of the 21st century. It suggested that the institutions responsible for managing national monetary reserves, the people in other words, whose professional responsibility is to assess the reliability of different stores of value, had concluded that gold deserved a larger place in the portfolio than the optimism of the 1990s had implied. Central bankers are not romantic about gold. When they buy it, the purchase represents a judgment about the world that is worth attending to. The relationship between gold and inflation has been more complicated in practice than in theory. The most common argument for holding gold as an investment is that it protects against inflation, that when the purchasing power of paper money falls, gold maintains its real value. This argument has a solid theoretical foundation. Gold cannot be printed, its supply grows only slowly through mining, and its demand as an alternative to paper money should rise when confidence in paper money falls. In practice, the relationship is less reliable than the theory suggests. Over very long periods, decades, gold has roughly maintained its purchasing power in real terms. An ounce of gold in ancient Rome could buy a high-quality toga. An ounce of gold today can buy a high-quality suit. This long-run stability is real, though the comparison requires some squinting. But over shorter periods, years or even decades, gold has been a poor inflation hedge. Gold lost more than half its real value between 1980 and 2000, a period that included significant inflation. Gold rose dramatically in the early 2020s while inflation also rose, but the correlation was not tight enough to be reliable. What gold protects against is not inflation specifically, but a more generalized loss of confidence in financial systems and the institutions that manage them. Inflation is one trigger for that loss of confidence, but not the only one. Wars, banking crises, currency collapses, political instability, all of these can drive demand for gold even in the absence of significant inflation. The metal is, more precisely, a hedge against systemic uncertainty than against any specific economic condition. Understanding that distinction is important for anyone trying to decide whether gold has a place in their financial thinking. The total amount of gold ever mined would fit inside roughly 3.5 Olympic swimming pools. One of the most grounding facts about gold is how little of it actually exists. The World Gold Council estimates that approximately 197,576 tons of gold have been mined throughout all of human history. This is a large number in absolute terms, but physically it is a modest amount. If you were to melt all the gold ever mined into a single cube, it would measure approximately 21.7 meters on each side, roughly the height of a 5-story building, filling an area smaller than a basketball court. The scarcity of gold is not an arbitrary feature of its monetary history. It is a geological fact, and the fact shapes everything else. Gold is rare because the processes that produce it, stellar explosions, the collision of neutron stars, the ancient geological upheavals of the early Earth, are themselves rare on a human scale. Most of the gold in the Earth's crust was brought here by meteorites in the first hundreds of millions of years of the planet's history, and most of it sank toward the Earth's core, unavailable to any miner. What remains accessible is a small fraction of a small fraction, concentrated in specific geological formations that must be found and extracted with considerable effort and expense. This scarcity has always been central to gold's monetary role. A monetary medium that could be created in unlimited quantities would lose its value as more was created. Gold's resistance to artificial augmentation, the difficulty of producing more of it whenever someone would find it convenient to do so, is precisely what made it suitable as money for so long. The same scarcity that makes gold frustrating as a monetary base in a growing economy makes it trustworthy as a store of value across time. As we come to the end of our journey, you might notice how gold feels now not just as a metal or an investment, but as one of the oldest and most persistent agreements that human beings have ever made with each other. We followed it from the burial grounds of Varna to the treasure rooms of Egyptian pharaohs, through the workshops of Lydian coin makers and the caravans of Mali's wealthiest king. We watched it cross the Atlantic in Spanish galleons, accumulate in Fort Knox and dissolve formally, from the foundation of the monetary system on a Sunday night in 1971. We saw it persist anyway, rising and falling with the fears of each generation, never quite leaving, never quite becoming merely a commodity. The agreement, it seems, is older than any institution and more durable than any policy. 7,000 years of human history have not found a replacement for it. If you are still awake and you would like another slow journey through the past, there will be a next video waiting for you on the screen. You can simply let it play and keep following the thread of discovery wherever it leads. And if this episode brought you calm curiosity, you might like, subscribe, or leave a comment. It helps the channel reach more listeners who need a softer place to land. But for now, you do not need to navigate anything at all. Let your jaw unclench, let your shoulders drop. Feel your breathing find an easier rhythm in and out like a tide that knows exactly where it belongs. Imagine the last light fading behind a quiet horizon and a steady world moving forward without effort. Sleep well and good night.